3 weeks after I signed the new will leaving the family farm to my son-in-law Tyler, my hunting buddy Dale pulled me aside at the feed store and said, "Harlan, you need to see something." He pulled out his phone, showed me a bank screenshot, an account in Tyler's name, opened 6 months before he married my daughter. Balance, $247,000. Regular deposits from a source I didn't recognize. The same son-in-law who told me he was starting from nothing. The same man I'd just made my sole heir. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything," Dale muttered, "but that don't sit right." Neither did the new will sitting in my lawyer's filing cabinet, and I had 30 days to change everything. My name is Harlan McCready. This farm, 1,200 acres of wheat and soybeans in western Ohio, has been in my family for 4 generations. I have 2 daughters, but only one ever showed interest in the land. When Audrey married Tyler, I thought I'd finally found someone to pass the legacy to. I signed over the farm in my will, made him the sole heir. But that bank account Dale showed me changed everything. $247,000 Tyler never mentioned. Hidden deposits from an unknown source. A man who said he was starting from nothing had been building a fortune in secret, and I had 30 days to figure out what else he'd been hiding. The McCready farm sits at the junction of County Road 9 and Township Line, 1,200 acres of flat black soil that's been feeding families since 1892. My great-grandfather cleared this land with a team of mules. My grandfather survived the Dust Bowl on it. My father worked himself into an early grave, keeping it solvent through the farm crisis of the 80s. And me, I've been here 68 years, born in the same farmhouse I still sleep in tonight. My wife Margaret passed 6 years ago. Cancer took her fast. After that, it was just me, the fields, and my 2 daughters. Grace, the older one, left for Columbus right after high school, accounting degree, high-rise apartment, city life. She visits at Christmas, calls on my birthday, hasn't set foot in a tractor since she was 14. No interest in the land whatsoever. Audrey, my younger one, was different. From the time she could walk, she followed me through the barns. She could identify wheat varieties by age 12, run the combine by 16. When she graduated college with an agribusiness degree, she came straight home. "This is where I belong, Dad," she said. "This is what I want." She's 28 now, hardworking, sharp, and for years I worried who would help her run this place when I'm gone. Farming 1,200 acres alone is impossible. She needed a partner. Then Tyler showed up. He moved to the county 5 summers ago, hired on at the grain elevator in town. New face, quiet, polite, started coming to church, volunteered at the 4-H livestock auction. When I met him at the feed store one Saturday morning, he shook my hand firm, looked me in the eye, called me sir, told me he'd grown up on a small farm 2 counties over, lost it to bank foreclosure when his father got sick, said he'd always wanted to get back to the land. I introduced him to Audrey at the county fair that fall. They married the following June. Small ceremony, our little country church, the reception in the barn dressed up with string lights. Tyler moved into the farmhouse with us. He was eager, humble, always asking questions about crop rotation and soil management. I taught him everything. He called me Dad within the first year. I'd never had a son, and here was this young man who seemed to love this land almost as much as I did. So when my lawyer Jim Holbrook suggested I update my estate plan, I knew exactly what to do. Audrey and Tyler would inherit the farm together, but I made Tyler the sole executor, the primary heir. I wanted a smooth transition, no sibling fights, no division of the land. Grace didn't want it, and Tyler had earned my trust. I signed the new will on a Tuesday afternoon in Jim's office, felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The legacy was secure. That was 4 months ago. 3 weeks ago, I added a codicil giving Tyler even more authority, full control of the operation after my death. No restrictions. I thought I was protecting the future. But here's what I didn't know. 6 months before he married my daughter, Tyler walked into the First Ohio Regional Bank, the same branch where my hunting buddy Dale Henderson works as a loan officer, and opened a personal savings account. He listed his address as a P.O. box in town, not the farm. He made regular cash deposits, always just under the reporting threshold. Over 2 years, those deposits totaled $247,000. Dale only noticed because he was reviewing dormant accounts for a compliance audit and recognized the name. He did some digging on his own, found the deposits came from a corporate entity called Greenfield Holdings LLC, a shell company registered in Delaware with no physical address, no website, no listed officers. Dale pulled me aside at the feed store because he was scared of getting fired for looking into a customer's account without authorization, but more scared of what he'd found. Harlan, those deposits are structured, he told me later that night when I drove over to his house. Small enough to avoid triggering alerts. That's money laundering technique or worse. And there's something else. He pulled up the account on his laptop. The most recent deposit was made the day after you filed that new codicil. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my kitchen with a cold cup of coffee, staring at the photograph on the wall of my father standing in front of this farmhouse in 1952. 4 generations of McCreadys had sweated and sacrificed to keep this land, and I just handed it to a man who'd been secretly building a fortune from a source he'd never mentioned. The next morning, I called Jim Holbrook. I didn't tell him about the account yet. I just asked how difficult it would be to revoke my new will. He said I could change it anytime, I'm of sound mind, but if Tyler caught wind, there could be complications. Ohio law gives broad rights to current beneficiaries to contest sudden changes, and Tyler could delay things in probate for years if he wanted to fight. So whatever I decided, Jim said, I needed to move fast and gather evidence before I acted. I had a narrow window, maybe 30 days from the codicil signing, before Tyler's legal position became substantially harder to challenge. 23 of those days remained. I needed to find out where that money came from, and I needed to do it without him knowing I suspected a thing. I started with the corporate registry. Greenfield Holdings LLC was a dead end, a filing agent in Wilmington, Delaware, nothing more, but I'm not a man who gives up easy. I called an old friend from my Army days who works in commercial real estate in Columbus. He ran some searches the normal way. 3 days later, he called back with a name. Greenfield Holdings is a front for a much larger operation, a multinational agricultural investment group that's been quietly buying up family farms across the Midwest. They use local brokers and shell companies to avoid attention, targeting properties with aging owners and uncertain succession plans. They'd acquired 4 farms in our county alone over the past 18 months, each one sold shortly after the owner died or entered a nursing home. My friend sent me the list. 3 of those farms had one thing in common. A young man named Tyler Brennan had appeared in the local land records as a witness or notary on the sale documents. I read that list twice, my hands shaking. Tyler hadn't just married into a farm. He'd been working with these people long before he met Audrey. I started watching him differently after that. The way he walked the fields now looked less like appreciation and more like surveying. The questions he asked about my health, about my retirement plans, suddenly felt calculated. Every conversation, every casual comment, played back in my mind with a sinister undertone. Then, 4 days later, I got the piece of evidence that turned everything from suspicion to certainty. The mail arrived while Tyler was out checking irrigation pivots. A thick envelope from a real estate attorney's office in Dayton, addressed to Tyler Brennan. I opened it. My heart stopped. Inside was a draft purchase agreement for the McCready Farm, 1,200 acres, detailed legal description, proposed sale price of $4.2 million. The buyer was listed as Greenfield Holdings LLC. The agreement was contingent only on the transfer of title upon the death of the current owner. And at the bottom, above Tyler's signature line, was a handwritten note from the attorney. Tyler, we'll finalize as soon as the estate clears probate. No one will contest your authority as executor. The deal is as good as done. My son-in-law had already sold my farm. He was just waiting for me to die. I stood in my own kitchen holding a purchase agreement that sold my land to strangers upon my death. The paper trembled in my hand, not from weakness, from something I hadn't felt since I buried Margaret. Rage, clean and cold. Tyler was out checking pivots. Audrey was at the co-op picking up seed treatment. I had the house to myself for maybe an hour. I copied every page of that agreement on my old printer, slid the originals back into the envelope, resealed it with a damp sponge, and placed it back in the mail stack. My hands moved like they belonged to someone else. A calm settled over me, the kind that comes when confusion finally hardens into purpose. I called Jim Holbrook from the barn phone, the landline with no chance of being overheard. His receptionist said he was in court all day, wouldn't be available until morning. I left a message saying it was urgent, that I needed to discuss revoking my will entirely. Then I sat in the tractor shed, and reviewed what I knew. Greenfield Holdings was buying family farms. Tyler was their local operative. He'd infiltrated my family, married my daughter, convinced me to make him executor, and now had a signed purchase agreement contingent on my death. The deposits were likely payments from Greenfield, money to keep him in position, waiting. But why so much? $247,000? That wasn't just a retainer. It was a finder's fee, maybe a down payment on the commission he'd get when the farm sold. $4.2 million. Even a 10% cut would be $420,000. Enough to disappear after, to start a new life somewhere without my daughter. But I needed more. I needed to know if anyone else had been hurt by this scheme. I needed to know if Audrey was in danger or, God help me, if she was involved. And I needed to know if Tyler was content to wait for nature to take its course or if he had a shorter timeline in mind. I drove out to the old Miller place first. The Millers had been our neighbors for 30 years until Harvey Miller passed 2 winters ago. His wife Dolores sold their farm to an investment group within weeks of the funeral. Everybody in the county thought it was grief, a widow wanting to be rid of the burden. But Dolores was a tough woman, raised 4 boys on that land. I always wondered why she'd leave so fast. She lived now in a small condo outside Dayton. I drove 2 hours to knock on her door. She recognized me through the screen, invited me in for coffee. We talked about the weather, about Margaret, about her boys scattered across the country. Then I asked her directly, "Dolores, how did you find the buyer for your farm?" Her face changed. Age fell on it like a shadow. "Holland, I didn't find anybody. A young man showed up a month after Harvey got sick. Said he worked with an agricultural preservation group that helped agging farmers transition their land to responsible owners. He was so kind, brought us meals, helped Harvey with paperwork." She paused, her coffee cup rattling in its saucer. "Harvey changed his will 3 weeks before he died, made that young man the executor. He said it would make things simpler." When Harvey passed, the farm sold in less than a month. I barely understood what I was signing. The young man handled everything. "What was his name, Dolores?" She looked at me, eyes watery. Tyler Brennan. "He was so kind," she repeated, and the word hung in the air like a confession she didn't know she was making. I drove back toward home with darkness falling over the fields. Harvey Miller had been diagnosed with late-stage lung cancer in October. By January, Tyler had befriended him. By February, Harvey's will had been changed. By March, Harvey was dead. Dolores never questioned the speed of any of it. She was grieving, overwhelmed, grateful for a kind stranger who took the paperwork off her hands. She hadn't even known the farm sold for $400,000 under market value until her sons found out months later and screamed about filing lawsuits. But by then the deed was transferred, the corporation was shielded, and the money was spent. The Miller farm, the Patterson place, the old Dietrich homestead, the Henderson South 40, all 4 families had the same story. An elderly owner, a sudden illness, a helpful young man appearing at the right moment, a will revision, a quick sale after death. Tyler Brennan's name appeared somewhere in all of them. Sometimes as witness, sometimes as executor, sometimes just as the friendly neighbor who recommended the right attorney. 4 farms in 18 months, 4 families shattered, 4 legacies liquidated. And now mine was number 5, the biggest one yet, the crown jewel of his career. I pulled over on a gravel road 3 miles from my house and killed the engine. The stars were coming out. My father used to say that a man's land isn't just soil and crops, it's memory, it's sweat that soaked into the ground and prayers said over broken equipment and promises made to the dead. Tyler was stealing all of it, not just the acres, the value. He was stealing my father's grave and my grandfather's foundation stones, and the tree where Margaret and I carved our initials 44 years ago. He was stealing the future I'd meant to give my grandchildren. Audrey, the thought of her cut through everything else. My daughter, my fierce, smart daughter who loved this farm, who'd found a partner she trusted, who came home from her honeymoon glowing with hope. Was she a victim or a conspirator? I couldn't believe she'd knowingly marry into a scheme to steal the land. But I also couldn't rule out that Tyler had manipulated her into signing things she didn't read. I'd seen her defer to him on financial decisions. She trusted him completely. That trust might already have been weaponized. I drove the last 3 miles home and found Tyler's truck in the driveway. He was in the kitchen when I walked in, heating soup on the stove. "Hey, Dad," he said without turning around. Long day, just checking equipment, I said. Same words I'd used for 40 years. Same casual tone, but every syllable felt like a lie I was telling him. He ladled soup into bowls, set one in front of me, asked about the pivot repairs like any good farmhand would. I watched his hands, steady. Comfortable, the hands of a man who'd already counted his money. I couldn't eat, but I made myself. I even smiled when he told me about some article on wheat futures. And when he asked if I'd heard from Jim Holbrook lately, I said no, and my heart didn't change rhythm. That night, I searched the barn office after everyone was asleep. Tyler kept a file cabinet in the corner, unlocked. I found folders labeled with farm names: Miller, Patterson, Dietrich, Henderson, each one containing property surveys, owner medical histories, notes on family members' vulnerabilities. He'd written assessments. Miller, estranged sons unlikely to contest. Dietrich, widow with dementia, no close relatives. Henderson, daughter in financial distress, motivated to sell quickly. I photographed everything with my phone. Then I found a folder labeled McCready. Inside was a timeline, my timeline, health records he'd somehow obtained, notes on my blood pressure medication, my cholesterol levels, my last physical exam results, a list of my bank accounts, copies of my will and codicil, and at the bottom a handwritten note that stopped my breath: target transfer queue for this year, funeral timeline, natural causes expected, if delays, plan B available. Discuss with GH, next meet. Plan B, the two words sat in my mind like a loaded shell. Tyler wasn't waiting for nature. He had an alternative, and he'd been discussing it with Greenfield Holdings. I replaced the files exactly as I'd found them, walked back to the house on legs that felt disconnected from my body. Audrey's light was off. Tyler was in the shower. I stood in my living room, surrounded by furniture my wife had chosen, looking at photographs of my daughters as children. This man had been in my home for 4 years. He'd called me dad. He'd held my granddaughter, hungry daughter, and promised her a future on this land. And the whole time, he'd been cataloging my vulnerabilities like a hunter studying prey. I called Jim Holbrook again at 7 the next morning. He answered this time. I told him everything. The account, the purchase agreement, the Miller story, the file cabinet. 10 seconds of silence followed. Then Jim said, "Holland, I'm coming out there right now. Don't do anything until I arrive. But the thing about doing nothing is that it gives the other side time to act." And Tyler, I would learn within hours, had already sensed something was wrong. Jim arrived at 9. We met in the machine shed far from the house. He brought a junior partner from his office and a portable scanner. We went through my evidence piece by piece. Jim's face grew grimmer with every document. "This is a criminal conspiracy," he said. "The deliberate targeting of elderly landowners for financial exploitation through fraudulent estate manipulation. We need to go to the sheriff, but we also need to protect your legal standing immediately. I want to revoke the most recent codicil today and start proceedings to overturn the will entirely on grounds of fraud and undue influence." He drafted the revocation on my tailgate. I signed it with a grease pen from the tractor toolbox. Jim notarized it on a clipboard. He promised to file it with the county recorder by noon. But before we could leave, my phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize. A photo, grainy, taken from a distance. It showed me talking to Jim beside the shed, the scanner visible, the documents spread on the tailgate. Beneath the image, 4 words: "You should have stayed quiet." Tyler knew he'd been watching us the whole time, and now I understood with sick certainty the timeline had just accelerated. Plan B was already in motion. Jim took one look at the photo and dialed the sheriff directly. We drove into town to file a protection order. But when we arrived at the courthouse, a deputy met us at the door. "Mr. McCready," he said, his face tight with discomfort, "you've been named in an emergency petition. A guardianship hearing has been scheduled for tomorrow morning. The petitioner alleges you're suffering from severe cognitive decline and are being exploited by outside parties who want to alter your estate for their own gain. The petitioner is Tyler Brennan. He's requested immediate temporary guardianship over you and all your assets, pending a full competency evaluation. He claims you're a danger to yourself and incapable of managing your affairs." Jim stepped forward. "Who filed this?" The deputy handed over the paperwork. An attorney named Marcus Webb had submitted it at 8:45 that morning, 15 minutes before Jim filed my codicil revocation. Tyler had beaten us to the courthouse. The judge had already set the hearing. If the petition succeeded, Tyler would have complete legal control over me, my farm, my bank accounts, every decision I made. I could be removed from my own home. I could be isolated from my lawyer. And the farm, worth $4.2 million, would be sold before my daughter even understood what was happening. I looked at Jim. How do we fight this? He spoke slowly, the weight of the situation settling between us. We have evidence, but they've moved first. Tomorrow, you'll stand in front of a judge. If you show any weakness, any confusion, any sign of age, they'll use it. And Tyler will walk out of that courtroom with the keys to everything you've ever built. I turned and looked out the courthouse window at the town I'd known my whole life. Then I looked at my phone, at the photo of me and Jim, at the message Tyler had sent. He'd been planning this for years, but I'd been living on this land for 68 of them. If he wanted a war over it, I'd give him one. That night, I didn't go home. Jim insisted I stay at his house, a brick ranch on the other side of town with a security system and a guest room. I agreed, but not for safety. I needed space to think without Tyler walking through my kitchen, without Audrey's eyes asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. Jim's wife made up the cooch while we spread documents across their dining table. We had 12 hours until the guardianship hearing. 12 hours to prove I was of sound mind, that Tyler's petition was fraudulent, that the entire scheme was criminal. Jim worked the phones. His junior partner researched case law. I sat with a legal pad and wrote down every detail I could remember about Tyler's arrival in our county, his courtship of Audrey, his questions about my estate. The timeline I'd found in his file cabinet burned in my memory. Target transfer Q4 this year. Funeral timeline, natural causes expected. If delays, plan B available. But something kept nagging at me. The Miller Farm, the Patterson Place, the Dietrich Homestead, the Henderson South 40. In every case, the owner had died not mysteriously, not under obviously suspicious circumstances, but died nonetheless. Harvey Miller had late-stage cancer. The timeline had merely been convenient. But what about the others? I asked Jim to pull up public records on his laptop. We searched obituaries, death certificates, probate filings. Ruth Patterson, 74, died of heart failure 9 weeks after her will was changed. Carl Dietrich, 81, died in a farming accident, a tractor rollover on land he'd worked for 50 years. Tom Henderson, 67, died of what the coroner listed as complications from pneumonia. 4 elderly landowners, 4 changed wills, 4 deaths within months of those changes. I pushed back from the table. Jim, I said, this isn't just fraud. Someone needs to look at those deaths. He stared at me, then picked up his phone and called a number he had saved from an old case. A retired medical examiner who now consulted on suspicious death investigations. He explained the situation while I stood at the window watching headlights pass on the county road. When Jim hung up, his voice was different, quieter. He says if even 2 of those deaths were unnatural, the pattern would be almost impossible to prove without exhumation and toxicology. And exhumation requires a court order, which requires probable cause. We don't have time for that before tomorrow's hearing, but we can raise the pattern. We can make the judge see what's happening. I turned from the window. We needed more than patterns. We needed proof that Tyler was dangerous now, not just suspicious in retrospect. And the proof was sitting in my barn in a file cabinet with my name on it. I called Dale Henderson. It was past 10 at night, but he answered on the second ring. I told him what I needed. He didn't hesitate. Give me an hour, he said. Dale had worked at First Ohio Regional for 22 years. He knew every system, every backdoor, every record retention policy. He also knew that Greenfield Holdings LLC had done more than deposit money into Tyler's account. The bank had processed wire transfers for Greenfield before, none flagged, none reported, but all archived. Dale accessed the records legally, pulling transaction histories he was authorized to review as part of his compliance role. What he found made my blood run cold. Greenfield Holdings had made payments to a medical services company called CareAll Solutions, registered in Nevada. CareAll Solutions, in turn, had paid invoices to a clinic in Dayton, Indiana, and that clinic employed a nurse practitioner named Sandra Webb. Sandra Webb was Marcus Webb's sister. Marcus Webb was Tyler's attorney, the same attorney who'd filed the guardianship petition, the same attorney who'd drafted the purchase agreement for my farm. I grabbed Jim's arm. They have a medical pipeline. They don't just change wills, they bring in medical personnel. They create paper trails of incapacity. They justify guardianships before anyone even knows to fight. Harvey Miller didn't just meet a helpful young man. He was probably drugged into confusion, so his will change looked voluntary. Ruth Patterson's heart failure, was it natural, or did someone help her heart fail? Carl Dietrich's tractor rollover, what were the odds a man who'd farmed safely for 50 years suddenly made a fatal mistake? And Tom Henderson, 67 years old, pneumonia complications, who had been treating him before he died. Jim was already dialing again. The retired medical examiner, a former FBI agent he knew from law school, the state attorney general's elder fraud unit. The clock read 11:32. We had 9.5 hours until the hearing, but Jim wasn't just preparing a defense anymore. He was building a criminal referral. He told me to get some sleep. I tried. I lay on the couch in his living room and closed my eyes, but every time I did, I saw Tyler's handwriting. Plan B available. Morning came gray and cold. January in Ohio, the sky the color of old pewter. I showered, put on the suit Jim had asked his wife to bring from the dry cleaner, and drank black coffee without tasting it. The hearing was set for 9 o'clock at the county probate court. Marcus Webb had requested Judge Elena Vance, who handled most of the guardianship cases in our circuit. She was known as thorough, fair, but also fast. She'd cleared 50 cases last month alone. The risk was that she'd see an 80-year-old farmer with an estranged daughter in Columbus and a concerned son-in-law with medical documentation, and she'd make a quick decision. Temporary guardianships were supposed to be emergency measures. By design, they weren't hard to get. We arrived at the courthouse at 8:30. Tyler was already there, standing in the hallway with Marcus Webb and a woman I didn't recognize, mid-50s, professional clothes, clipboard in hand. Her presence answered a question I hadn't thought to ask. Marcus Webb's sister Sandra was here, the nurse practitioner. They were bringing medical testimony to the hearing. Tyler saw me and smiled, the same easy smile he'd used for 4 years at my dinner table. "Holland," he said, his voice carrying down the corridor, "I'm sorry it had to come to this. We're just trying to help. You've been confused lately. The farm's been slipping. I just want to make sure you're safe." I didn't answer. Jim had told me not to speak to him at all, no matter what he said. Every word could be twisted, repeated, used as evidence of instability. So I walked past him without even turning my head, and the silence was louder than anything I could have said. Courtroom was small, wood-paneled, fluorescent lights humming overhead. Judge Vance entered at 9 sharp. She was a black woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain and an expression that revealed nothing. She reviewed the petition, then asked Marcus Webb to present his case. Webb stood, buttoned his jacket, and began, "Your Honor, this is a tragic situation. Mr. McCready is 80 years old. His wife passed 6 years ago. He lives alone on a large farmstead with no daily oversight. In recent months, his behavior has become erratic. He's made impulsive financial decisions, including a hasty attempt to revoke long-standing estate documents. He's been observed meeting with unknown individuals on his property. His son-in-law, my client Mr. Brennan, has lived in the home for over 4 years and has witnessed a steady cognitive decline. We have medical documentation and testimony supporting this assessment." Tyler then took the stand. Wore a navy blazer I'd never seen before. His voice was soft, sad, the voice of a man burdened by love. "He's been forgetting things," he said, "basic things. Yesterday he left the gate open and half the cattle got into the road. He's paranoid about money, accuses people of stealing from him. Last month he yelled at Audrey for no reason, just screamed at his own daughter. I'm scared he's going to hurt himself out there. The farm is too much for him. I just want to get him proper care." He looked at the judge with eyes that seemed to glisten. "I love him like a father." Sandra Webb followed. She presented records from a clinic visit Tyler had arranged 3 months earlier, a routine physical, he told me. But the records described me as disoriented, confused, unable to recall recent events. She'd noted possible early-stage dementia and recommended follow-up testing. I'd never been told about that note. I'd never seen those records. The physical had felt normal. The doctor had asked me questions, I'd answered them. But the record on file told a different story. Someone had written a fiction and called it medicine. Judge Vance read the documents with no change in expression. She asked Sandra Webb a few questions about her credentials, her clinical methodology, the basis for her dementia screening. Sandra answered smoothly, 22 years in geriatric care, standardized assessment tools, clear indicators. Then Jim stood. His cross-examination was surgical. He asked Sandra if she'd ever treated me before that visit. She admitted she had not. He asked if she'd reviewed my prior medical history. She said records were unavailable. He asked if her brother Marcus Webb had referred me to her clinic. She hesitated. Yes, she said finally. And is your brother the attorney who filed this guardianship petition? Yes. And is your brother the attorney who drafted the purchase agreement for Mr. McCready's farm, contingent upon his death, with your brother's client as the executor? The courtroom went still. Marcus Webb stood to object. Judge Vance silenced him with a raised hand. Let Mr. Holbrook continue, she said. Jim walked to the evidence table and picked up a folder. Your Honor, this guardianship petition is not a protective measure. It is a step in a coordinated conspiracy to steal this man's land. He described the pattern. The Miller farm, the Patterson farm, the Dietrich farm, the Henderson farm. 4 elderly victims, 4 changed wills, 4 deaths, 4 properties sold to Greenfield Holdings, LLC, a shell company that also employed Tyler Brennan. He described the deposits. $247,000. The purchase agreement for my farm, signed and waiting. The file cabinet with my medical history and the handwritten note about Plan B. He submitted copies of everything. He called Dale Henderson to testify about the accounts. He called Dolores Miller, who'd driven in from Dayton that morning, to tell the court what Tyler had done to her husband. Judge listened to everything. Her pen never stopped moving, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When Jim finished, she removed her glasses and looked directly at Marcus Webb. Mr. Webb, she said, I'm going to give you one opportunity to withdraw this petition voluntarily before I rule. Webb stood again, but the confidence was gone from his posture. He muttered something about acting in good faith, about genuine concern for my welfare. The judge cut him off. Withdraw the petition, counselor. Now. He did. Judge Vance then turned to me. Mr. McCready, she said, I'm dismissing this petition with prejudice. You are clearly of sound mind, and I commend your attorney for presenting what appears to be evidence of a serious criminal enterprise. I'm referring this matter to the county prosecutor and the state attorney general's office for investigation. You are free to go. She banged her gavel. It was over, at least in that courtroom. But as I stood to leave, I saw Tyler's face across the aisle. His mask had slipped, just for a moment. Beneath the charm was something cold, calculating, furious. Then he smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. See you at home, Dad, he said softly enough that only I could hear. Audrey's waiting. Audrey, I'd been so focused on fighting the guardianship that I hadn't had time to face what came next. My daughter was still married to a predator. She still lived in my house with a man who'd plotted my death. And I still didn't know what she understood, what she'd signed, what she believed. Driving home from the courthouse, Jim in the passenger seat, I made 3 calls. The first was to the sheriff, asking for a deputy to meet us at the farm. The second was to a locksmith in town. The third was to my older daughter Grace in Columbus. She hadn't been home in 2 years, but she answered on the first ring. Dad, what's wrong? I told her. Everything, I said, but I'm fixing it. I need you to come home. She said she'd leave within the hour. I hung up and looked at the fields rolling past the truck window. My fields, my land, not for sale, not for Tyler, not for anyone. And if my daughter Audrey stood with him when the truth came out, then she'd made her choice too. But I was done being prey. The war wasn't over, it was just beginning. The sheriff's deputy was already in my driveway when we pulled in. A young woman named Deputy Flores, sharp-eyed and serious. Jim had briefed her on the situation during the drive. She'd called for backup, 2 more units en route, but she walked with me to my own front door like she understood this was my ground to reclaim. I didn't knock. I opened the door and stepped inside. Tyler was in the living room, sitting in my leather chair with a beer in his hand, the television playing some afternoon talk show. He looked up and his expression flickered surprise, then calculation, then a mask of weary patience. Harlan, he said, I was worried about you. After that scene in court, I didn't know where you'd gone. Audrey appeared from the kitchen, her face pale, a dish towel clutched in her hands. Dad, what's going on? Deputy Flores told me about the court hearing. An emergency guardianship. You tried to have me declared incompetent. I watched Audrey's face as I spoke. Her eyes went from confusion to shock to something I couldn't read. Tyler set down his beer. Harlan, you're confused again. I was just trying to protect you from stop. My voice cracked like a shot. I'm not confused. I haven't been confused once in this entire nightmare. I know about the bank account. I know about Greenfield Holdings. I know about the Millers and the Pattersons and the Dietrichs and the Hendersons. I know about the purchase agreement for my farm waiting in your attorney's office. And I know about the file cabinet in the barn with my medical history and your handwritten note about Plan B. Tyler's mask held for 3 more seconds, then it didn't. His face changed. The man who'd called me dad for 4 years vanished, replaced by something colder, thinner. You have no proof of anything, he said. A file cabinet with some notes. An overactive imagination. You're an old man, Harlan. You're confused. That's what the court will see. Deputy Flores stepped forward then, her hand resting on her duty belt. Sir, I think you should stop talking. I pulled out my phone. I'd been recording since I walked through the door. Tyler saw the screen, saw the red recording indicator, and his mouth closed into a hard line. Deputies arrived. They took statements. They didn't arrest him that afternoon. Jim had warned me it might take time to build the full criminal case, but they served him with a restraining order and gave him 30 minutes to collect personal belongings. Audrey stood frozen in the kitchen doorway the whole time, saying nothing, watching her husband pack a duffel bag with the same hollow expression I'd seen on Dolores Miller's face when she talked about Harvey. When Tyler's truck finally pulled out of the driveway, the silence that settled over the house was almost physical. I sat down at the kitchen table. Audrey sat across from me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "Dad, I didn't know." 3 words that carried the weight of 4 years. I looked at her, my daughter who'd loved this farm since she could walk, and I made a decision. I chose to believe her, but there was work to do. The next morning, Jim called with news. The county prosecutor had opened a formal investigation. The state attorney general's elder fraud unit had assigned 3 investigators, and the FBI, Jim said, had been looking into Greenfield Holdings for 8 months already, tracking a pattern of suspicious farm acquisitions across 6 states. What we'd uncovered in one small Ohio county was the local tentacle of something much larger. Tyler wasn't the mastermind. He was a regional operative, one of several, all using the same playbook: marry into, befriend, or manipulate agging landowners, insert themselves into estate plans, and then liquidate the properties to a corporate buyer that erased family legacies as efficiently as a bulldozer. I spent that week securing everything. Jim filed the final revocation of my will and codicils. We created an irrevocable trust for the farm, transferring ownership to a professional trustee, Ohio Farm Trust, a nonprofit that specialized in preserving family farms from exactly this kind of predation. The trust terms were ironclad. The land could never be sold outside the family bloodline as long as a single McCready wanted to work it. If no McCready remained, it would become a conservation easement, protected farmland forever, never to be developed or commodified. I signed the documents on a Thursday afternoon in Jim's office, and when I set down the pen, I felt something shift. Not relief, exactly, more like a foundation settling back into place after an earthquake. The investigation accelerated quickly after that. The FBI raided Greenfield Holdings' office in Delaware. They seized servers, financial records, correspondence with operatives in 7 states. Tyler was arrested 3 weeks later, not just for fraud, but for conspiracy to commit murder. Sandra Webb had turned state's evidence. She admitted to falsifying medical records for at least 11 elderly victims, creating paper trails of dementia to justify guardianships. She also admitted to administering medications that weren't medically necessary, sedatives, confusion-inducing drugs, to vulnerable patients whose wills had been changed. Harvey Miller had been one of them. The drugs weakened his already compromised system. The coroner revised his death certificate. Carl Dietrich's tractor rollover was re-examined. The FBI found evidence the brake line had been tampered with. Tom Henderson's pneumonia complications were traced to an untreated infection that Sandra Webb had deliberately ignored during home visits. Ruth Patterson's heart failure remained inconclusive, but the pattern was undeniable. 8 victims across the Midwest, whose deaths occurred within months of estate changes. And Tyler Brennan, my son-in-law, had been Greenfield's top producer in Ohio. Audrey filed for divorce the day after Tyler's arrest. She moved into the farmhouse guest room and didn't speak much for the first few weeks. I gave her space. I knew what it felt like to have your reality shattered by someone you trusted. But slowly, she started coming back. She'd find me in the barn and ask about the spring planting. She'd ride with me to check the fields. One evening, she sat down at the kitchen table with a notebook and showed me a business plan she'd been working on, diversifying the farm into organic grains, a direct-to-bakery supply chain, a farm stand on the county road. "I haven't been able to think about anything else," she said, her voice steadier than it had been in months. "This is what I still want, Dad. I just didn't know how to trust what I wanted after everything." I looked at her plan, at the careful numbers and crop rotation schedules, and for the first time since Dale pulled me aside at the feed store, I felt something like hope. In April, the first convictions came down. Sandra Webb pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraudulent medical practice and conspiracy. Marcus Webb was disbarred and charged with fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. Greenfield Holdings LLC was dissolved by federal order, its assets seized. And Tyler Brennan was convicted on 18 felony counts, including fraud, elder exploitation, and conspiracy to commit murder, sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. I didn't attend the sentencing. Jim said I had the right to give a victim impact statement, but I had nothing left to say to Tyler that the law hadn't already said for me. Then came the final surprising detail, the thing I hadn't seen coming even after everything I'd uncovered. In May, an FBI investigator named Chen called me to his office in Columbus. They'd been tracing Greenfield's funding, and they'd found a silent partner who'd invested millions into the operation, backing the shell companies that bought the stolen farms. The partner was a venture capital firm based in Chicago, run by a man who'd grown up in our county, a man who'd left 40 years ago and made a fortune in agribusiness consolidation. The man's name was Harold Dietrich, Jr., Carl Dietrich's son. Carl, who died in a tractor rollover on the farm his son had grown up hatting, a farm Junior had always resented for keeping his father too busy to attend baseball games. Junior had left Ohio, built his empire, and then started funding the very operation that killed his own father to acquire the land he'd always felt was owed to him. He didn't know Carl was on Greenfield's target list, he claimed in his deposition, but the FBI found emails. He'd known. He'd approved the acquisition. The Dietrich homestead, 160 acres of prime Ohio bottomland, had been transferred to a Greenfield subsidiary 3 weeks after Carl's death, and Harold Dietrich Jr. had pocketed the profit from a company he secretly owned. He was arrested at O'Hare Airport, attempting to board a flight to Zurich. That story made national news. But for me, it was just the final confirmation of something I'd learned the hard way. The line between family and transaction can be drawn in anything, even blood, and some people will cross it without blinking. I stood on my front porch that evening and watched the sun set over the wheat fields. The winter wheat was coming in thick green waves rippling in the May breeze. My farm, my father's farm, my grandfather's farm, still a McCready place, still whole. Audrey was in the barn checking on a calf born that morning. Grace had come home for the weekend from Columbus, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and a stack of seed catalogs, talking about maybe spending more time out here this summer. The trust documents sat in a fireproof safe in my office, alongside my new will, a simple one, leaving everything equally to both daughters, no executors, no complications. I'd also added a provision Jim had suggested: any future spouse of any McCready heir must sign a prenuptial agreement waiving all claims to the farm. Audrey had already agreed. She understood now what the land meant and what it could attract. The investigation was still ongoing. Chen said there were at least 20 more families across the Midwest who might have been victimized by Greenfield operatives. I gave them Dolores Miller's address. I gave them the names of every family I'd tracked down. I told them I'd testify anywhere, anytime, if it helped another old farmer keep what his father had built. Then I poured a glass of iced tea and sat on the porch and let the quiet settle over me. 4 months earlier, a hunting buddy had pulled me aside at a feed store and shown me a bank account. That moment had cracked open a conspiracy that stretched across state lines, that had claimed lives, that had come within one court hearing of stealing my land and my freedom. Now the conspiracy was shattered. The criminals were in prison. The farm was protected beyond any future predator's reach. And I was still here, still planting, still harvesting, still standing. I think about that day at the feed store often now. The moment Dale pulled out his phone and showed me that account. A simple act. A friend who trusted his gut enough to speak up. That moment didn't just change the trajectory of my family's land, it saved my life. Not just legally, but literally. Because if I hadn't known, if I'd stayed in the dark another few months, Plan B might have already been executed. The coroner might have written natural causes on my death certificate, and another farm would have quietly changed hands, and nobody would have ever asked the question that needed asking. And that's what haunts me. How many others never got their moment? How many agging farmers and ranchers and landowners across this country are being targeted right now by people who have perfected the art of looking like family while acting like predators? Greenfield Holdings is gone. Tyler Brennan is in prison. Harold Dietrich Jr. is awaiting trial, but the playbook didn't die with that case. The methods, the charm, the isolation, the medical manipulation, the weaponization of the guardianship system, those are out there still, being refined, being used. I was lucky. I had a hunting buddy who worked at a bank and paid attention. I had a lawyer who moved fast and fought hard. I had daughters who came home when it mattered. Not everyone has those things. So I'm telling you this story not because it's mine, but because it might be someone else's. Maybe yours. Look at the people around, the elderly folks you love, the helpful new friend who appeared at just the right time, the sudden changes in estate papers, the new diagnoses from unfamiliar doctors, the isolation from family, the pressure to sell. If any of that sounds familiar, ask questions, demand answers, call a lawyer. Don't wait until the hearing is already scheduled and the medical records have already been falsified. Because by then, you're fighting from behind and the system isn't always fast enough to catch up. My farm is still here, 1,200 acres of black soil, winter wheat waving in the wind. The trust is ironclad. My daughters have a future on this land if they want it, and a family legacy that no one can ever steal again. I stand on my porch in the evenings now, watch the sunset paint the barn gold, and I feel something I thought I'd lost: peace. Not because the danger is gone forever, but because I know now that I'm strong enough to face whatever comes. I'm still planting, still harvesting, still standing. If this story meant something to you, if it made you think about the vulnerable people in your own life, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and so do the people who need to hear that they're not alone. For the next story, tap the video on your screen. Thank you for listening, and keep your eyes open. The people you love are worth it.